We're coming off of reading Jean-Paul Sartre's Existentialism as a Humanism, sliding into this brief essay by Japanese philosopher Seizo Ohei, Nature and Culture in Human Freedom, and I think it's a very interesting thing to read next. Certainly, what I've heard from students this particular time around is that Sartre takes things a little too far in terms of claims for human freedom. That is, it does seem that Sartre is a radical and kind of an absolutist when it comes to human freedom. That human beings are radically free, human beings are absolutely free, and that any claim otherwise is a kind of form of bad faith, a kind of an evasion of responsibility. That rang hollow in some people's ears, and perhaps for those people, Ohei comes up with a better, more sensible, rational, reasonable assessment of the reality of human freedom. And certainly, in the big picture here, it's freedom that he's interested in, not just sort of understanding freedom, but also, as he indicates at the end, expanding freedom and becoming more free. How do we do that? He opens this essay by saying the philosophic controversy between determinism and indeterminism is almost as old as philosophy itself. I don't know how unfamiliar or familiar are those terms, determinism and indeterminism. Determinism is just the notion that everything that happens in the universe is determined, which is a way of saying it's caused by something else. And it's a very controversial scientific and metaphysical thesis, even within natural science, questioned certainly by modern physics in a way that's very radical. But the notion is that everything happens in the universe is caused by something else. It's determined as an event by something that precedes it. If human actions and human behaviors are events in the physical universe, then the same laws, the same deterministic laws, the same rules apply to them. That is what human beings do. Every one of their actions is caused by something else. Now, if we apply that thesis to human actions, then of course the notion of free human actions and freedom in general becomes problematic. And one might say that if you're a traditional hardcore determinist, you don't really believe in human freedom. Everything that we do is determined by something else. It's not a spontaneous free action as possible. Indeterminism would just simply be the rejection of determinism of various forms, saying, well, that it may be that every action or every event, rather, in the physical universe is determined by something else, but human behavior and human action is different. It's anomalous. It's not determined by the same laws. And, the metaphysical thesis, it can neither be proven or disproven. Determinism can't be it, and indeterminism can't be, but they seem to be radical polar opposites in terms of possibility of human freedom. Ohei, without going into the matter in any depth, says right away that he doesn't want to be either, that he wants to take a kind of a middle position here, and he indicates that in the first paragraph by saying man is neither entirely free nor entirely bound, which seems sensible in the outset, but whether it is the right position, I don't know. But the notion that, of course, determinism can't be fully right. I mean, we're just too attached to the concept that we have some freedom of choice in our actions to really seriously believe that everything that we do is determined by causes beyond ourselves. Nothing like freedom of the will. On the other hand, there's a concession here that freedom is subject to rather real and severe limits, which perhaps, I don't know, I think what Sartre actually said in this matter entirely clear, but at least one reading. Ohei seems to be denying Sartre's position of absolute freedom. So it is freedom that he's, is interested in, and I guess really determining, what is it that, what are the most important elements in human freedom, and what is it that enables it, what is it that limits it, and how can it be expanded? And really interesting stuff that Ohei is getting at. So that's the big picture. Then we move to the first section, which is very interesting, and not only intrinsically interesting for what he says, but I think historically and culturally interesting too. I am not really very knowledgeable about Asian cultures in general, or Japanese culture in particular, and certainly not about Japanese views on the particular matters that Ope discusses. But there's something very almost quaint about his discussion here. And what he wants to establish about the power of culture may be something that is just so familiar to us, it doesn't seem to be something that even needs to be proved. Very interesting, his so-called imaginative experiment in the first section here, where he imagines, or he asks us to imagine, that a Japanese infant and an Eskimo infant are switched at birth. What will happen? That is, what will be the careers, the trajectories of those two infants? And he says, claims, and it seems to be a pretty reasonable claim, that the Eskimo infant raised by a Japanese family in Japan will become fully Japanese, become a Japanese person, if not genetically, whatever that means, in every other respect, and vice versa, or not vice versa. And the same goes for the Japanese infant raised in an Eskimo family in Eskimo culture. And that may be obvious, but it may not have been as obvious in the 60s in Japan. I don't know. That's something that other people much more knowledgeable about. But what is this? What's the point of pointing this out? Well, I mean, he mentions, children who don't have education, who are not raised by human beings. So the sort of infamous cases, and they're very doubtful in terms of their veracity, of the sort of various wild childs, the feral children who are discovered, children who didn't have the benefit of decent, parents and others that teach them language and social skills. And the really unfortunate truth that is a fairly early in childhood, if you don't have that teaching, it becomes too late. I don't know whether it's 5 or 6 or 8 or 10 or whatever, but at a certain point, a human being who has not been taught language, it becomes impossible to teach them language, to fully socialize them. And that's really interesting. I mean, what is this first section about? It's really about the power of culture informing us as human beings. Not just the power of particular cultures, Japanese, Eskimo, American, whatever, but the power of culture itself. He says on page 314, towards the bottom of the second column, in short, all that is a priori, that is all that is beforehand, given to an offspring of man as an animal, seems to be only the possible upright posture and the ability of learning a language in his childhood, and everything beyond that must be acquired in human companionship. It's a pretty interesting thesis that what are we given at birth, generally, naturally? The possibility of learning a language and speaking and walking upright. Beyond that, everything comes from human companionship. Everything in terms of development is cultural. Which is not to say we don't have what he calls bio-natural development. I mean, that's the distinction he makes right after that. He refers to the process of human growth can be analyzed into a bio-natural and a socio-cultural process. And in any human being, those two things are so, as he acknowledges, so inextricably intertwined that you can't really separate them except, in thought. But these various imaginative experiments referring to allow us to see that there are these two different levels of human development, the bio-natural and the socio-cultural. And that certainly we are, to a certain extent, hardwired as human beings, genetically, physically, biologically. But as it turns out, that hardwiring or our physical or purely genetic or biological potentials are absolutely dependent upon culture for their realization. That is, a human being, biologically, their brain is primed to learn language. There's no doubt about it. However, if another human being, or really a group of human beings, doesn't teach the infant, the child, how to speak, the thing won't happen by itself, and if it doesn't happen by a certain age, it will never happen, which is really fascinating. Brain development, that. But what is the big philosophical payoff of this, I think? Well, he says something very, very interesting on page 315, the bottom of the first column. He says, in the same way, to be human in full, not just to be biologically a member of the species, but to be human in full, we have to be not only born of human parents, but also brought up by them. Very interesting way of putting it, because what it's basically saying is that to be human in full, not simply a biological thing, it is a biocultural thing. So that if we are not brought up by human parents, it doesn't have to be your biological parents, obviously, it doesn't have to be parents at all, but we have to be brought up, nurtured, cultivated, encultured, educated by other human beings in order to become human. Which is to say that our nature, our essential nature, is both biological and cultural. And that really, for me, the importance of that is pointing out that the second, culture, is just as important as the first. That is, it's not something that is superficial cultural aspects of it. It's something that is essential, that is, we wouldn't really be human without it. It's very interesting. Think of the kind of speculation about human evolution and the way that certainly biological evolution enables culture, but also cultural developments have affected our biological evolution too. It's very interesting. So, you know, in a way, something, the stuff that he's pointing out here is kind of obvious. It's maybe a sign of the times. It was less obvious in the 1960s in Japan than it's now, 40 or 50 years later. But you know, the notion that a child switches birth is obviously adopt the language and culture of the place where they grow up. But on the other hand, he's got a pretty big point to make here, and that is the power of culture in forming the human being. And what we'll look at section 2 in the next talk is really how does that power and that dialectic between nature and culture, how does that reflect on the possibilities of human freedom?